This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
If we can't find a way to create that balance by being in relationship with each other, by appreciating the differences in the ways that we approach problems and doing it to some extent together, then what happens is you put this into these moral differences, the taste bud differences, into motion inside of a polarized environment, and you start to get to where it's like we're not getting better by our interaction. Our distance and sort of the equal and opposite reaction cycle is actually spinning us into these kind of untenable and ridiculous positions.
The Village Square, a nervy bunch of liberals and conservatives who believe that disagreement and dialogue make for a good conversation, a good country, and a good time. At the Village Square, we talk about politics, religion, and race. You know, the topics your mom taught you never to discuss in polite company. Listen, at the Village Square, we make pigs fly.
Hey folks, welcome to Village Squarecast. This is Corey Nathan. So glad to be with you again. Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Flying Pig Academy with Liz Joyner and Bill Maddox on how Jonathan Haidt wrote the book for pigs with higher aspirations. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Check out Florida Humanities online at floridahumanities.org. So we're just going to get right to this fun conversation that the delightful and lovely founder and president of Village Square, Liz Joyner, is having with the Village Square's former chairman of the board of directors, Bill Maddox. It's focused on Jonathan Haidt's 2013 book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. But you'll see their dialogue springboards into a whole other level, including a really terrific reference to one of my favorite scenes from a movie. And you'll just have to listen to the end for that one. So enjoy this conversation, and I will hop back on with you at the end.
Hey Bill, it's I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have today in our second conversation in our Flying Pig Academy series. And to introduce you to our listeners, Bill Maddox is the former chair of the Village Square Board of Directors, and he is with the James Madison Institute, one of our favorite partners in our community, in our hometown. They feel like our friends. And then really importantly to this conversation, Bill is the genius veteran facilitator for one of our repeat book clubs, probably over a dozen, he had estimated, of The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics, by Dr. Jonathan Haidt. So
Yeah,
glad you're with us, Bill.
yeah, I'm delighted to do this. It's a great book. I've thoroughly enjoyed leading book clubs, and I've done, like you say, a dozen or so of these over the last 10, 12 years with very different groups. I first began doing them with some summer interns that came and worked for us, and then have since done a number of these with much more diverse audiences. Sometimes we even one summer paired a group of interns with a group of, I don't know, 60 plus, age 60 plus members of the Village Square. So we had this really interesting young versus old dynamic, which wasn't, versus is the wrong word, because I think both groups thoroughly enjoyed hearing how people look at this, both from across the political spectrum, but even some from across the age spectrum. So anyway, it's been a great book, and one that has lots of good grist for discussion.
So if I had posited that if there were an official team sport for the Village Square, reading books like this is one of them. We've done it for, almost 2 decades now. And in a lot of ways it's been all about seeking understanding and greater insight into how it is we do our very mandatory but impossible job together. And so we've spent a lot of time reading.
Yeah, and I do think books and film and music and other kind of cultural artifacts are useful as discussion starters because they give people an opportunity to kind of focus simultaneously on a third object in the room, so to speak, instead of kind of pointing fingers at each other necessarily. And you're able, in the course of reading a work or considering a film or hearing the same piece of music or whatever, you're able to then kind of come at it from different perspectives. And oftentimes it's fascinating, really, to see how someone who sees the world differently will, react to a kind of common object that you're considering together. And it often facilitates kind of the discovery of common ground that is often important as a foundation before kind of getting into things that we disagree about.
Agree completely. And a little bit more context setting is that in sort of that seeking and learning, it was pretty early on, and it was before The Righteous Mind came out as a book that I saw an article that John Haidt wrote in the New York Times, and I reached out to him, and really, in some ways, the conversation hasn't stopped since. And he has been an extraordinary mentor and partner in trying to really understand the situation that we're in. And he's been incredibly generous with I mean the with the rise of the popularity of this book and his fame and subsequent books, that he has no time to do anything, and yet I have seen him be generous across our whole space. So I guess I just want to make that shout out to him and thank him for his generosity, and then also maybe apologize to him for any butchering we do of his
Oh
excellent.
yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad for the apology, but I'm also really glad for the shout out and kind of nod of appreciation because he has been extraordinarily generous, and it hasn't been a generosity that has been kind of out of the sense that you sometimes get of, oh, I'm a big shot and I'd like to share with you some of the fruits of my wealth. It in many ways is kind of consistent with the spirit of the book, which is one of the things that I find most impressive. And that is the book is brilliant. There are just numerous insights that I think are groundbreaking and extremely helpful. But the spirit of the book is one of extraordinary, in my mind, intellectual humility. And I think he has approached the village square with that same spirit of humility that says, okay, sure, I'm an academic. I understand things at a kind of 10,000-foot level. But I have tremendous respect for those of you who are working on the ground at the street level, dealing with some of these kinds of things in a practical setting, in a community that's trying to forge common ground and build goodwill. And I think he has enjoyed learning from us, if that's possible, just as we have obviously enjoyed learning from him.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's been interesting to, inside of the political division that we're experiencing, nearly everything that gets well known gets controversial at some level, right? And one of the things that has been a joy for me to watch in how he's handled that, he really, really does believe. He really is humble in that way. He really believes he wants to hear what others how others disagree with him. He engages that disagreement. And in fact, I had the pleasure as he was finishing the book of being introduced by somebody that John had reached out to sort of be another ear with a very different political background
Mhm.
to challenge him and challenge his thinking. He really believes, as we do and we always have at the Village Square, that it's that strengthening of thinking that comes from diversity of opinion that actually gets you somewhere. That
Yeah.
it's a really important part of almost any process, right? Of deliberations, of a team trying to accomplish a goal, a jury, and
Mhm.
citizens in a democracy are represented in a democracy. So yeah, just
Yeah,
hat
very, it's
to
very
John.
illustrative of the old idea of iron sharpening iron,
Yeah.
that, when we clash and come at things a little bit differently, we often end up both being better off for it.
Absolutely. And that is really one of the things that I think is so dangerously uh, decreasing and or sometimes missing in our
Yeah.
environment. And to me, it also sort of has something to do with the rise of extremism. Because if you surround yourself with people who look and think like you, then you don't get to experience that sort of iron sharpens iron.
Yeah.
So
Totally
anyway,
agree.
I'm going to throw out a maybe one of the first concepts in the book that really grabs me, and I would like to hear then what something that grabs you. So,
Yep.
in terms of our work, I think that the thing that has most deeply changed really how we do everything, but then also frankly, I'd say that how I perceive all of my life is the metaphor about the rider and the elephant and the way John expresses it, and you'll help me. We did very little study ahead of this, so it's just coming off the top of the head.
Yeah.
The mind is divided like a rider and the elephant, and the it isn't that the rider is the one in control; it's really the elephant. The rider's job is to serve the elephant, and this is speaking directly to the concept that human beings really don't reason in a rational way, that we reason in an intuitive way. And also, another part of that metaphor that I think is extremely important is that our elephants, our intuitions, um, are a very sometimes precognitive. They're not something that we're thinking through, and that also they're affected very heavily by the environment the elephant is in and by other elephants. And so, as an organization that was founded with the village square, the name comes from to the village square, we must carry the facts of atomic energy. From there must come America's voice, which is Albert Einstein's quote. And so we started this endeavor off thinking, well, we really need to zero right in on facts, and then once we figure out the facts, then everything is going to be, we'll all agree on something, whatever that is. Well, boy, oh boy, did we ever learn a quick lesson, both from John's work and and from this incredible metaphor that I think if you carry it in your mind, it explains so much. Then also for what we were seeing in front of our faces, right? We were seeing exactly this premise in our big groups of people in our panels, and we sort of had a aha moment with that.
Yeah, it's yeah, that kind of tension between intuition and reason is a really helpful, and John breaks this down and explains this very carefully and kind of walks through the whole history of how we have arrived at certain conclusions in science and philosophy and whatnot. But the thing to me that's really interesting here is that um, he's he uses in the book, and this is just part of the brilliance of the book, because this is really a form thing more than it is a concept, and that is he uses these what he calls harmless taboo scenarios and kind of throws them in your lap. And I remember the first one, as I recall, was like a family is driving home from some event. On their drive, a dog runs out in front of the car too quickly for the driver to swerve to miss it, hits the dog, and the dog dies. And they stop the car and they get out to kind of check on the dog, and they see that the dog is dead, and they regret that this accident has occurred and that this dog has lost its life. But then after a few minutes, they say, we are hungry. And the question is, should we take the dog home to cook and eat it? And so he kind of throws this. So he's kind of breaking all sorts of taboos, especially at least in Western life, by
Yeah.
posing this question, which is a very, very Village Square kind of thing to do, is
Yeah.
to kind of break taboos. And so, but in posing this question, he asks us, as we're reading this and discussing this, okay, well, if it is wrong for the family to eat the dog, why? And what is fascinating is that people will come to the conclusion that it is wrong for the family to eat the dog much more quickly than they will be able to often offer reasons why. And I think part of what he's trying to do in using these harmless taboo scenarios, and there are a number of them, and boy, for a book club leader, they are gold. I mean, it is the best way to kind of get a really good and interesting conversation going. But what they do is they help us to see, oh gosh, yeah, in a lot of cases, we draw a conclusion kind of from a gut instinct, from our intuition, and then often we'll look for reasons to explain why we think this is right or wrong. And this is very much his point, is that the our intuition is a lot like the elephant, and our ability to reason is a lot like the rider. And we, especially in the West, especially educated people in the West, like to think of ourselves as being cool, rational people who carefully weigh the pros and cons before drawing any sort of conclusion. And what John is able to show is that it ain't so, or at least isn't so to the degree that we'd like to think. And that many of us often do follow this pattern of being guided first and foremost by our intuition.
Well, and it's easy to see that operating in people you don't agree with. But it's so much harder to see it operating in people you do agree with, and or even hardest with yourself. And so one of the things that, I think we've probably had a little bit of a unique walk through the years, because we've been constantly trying to figure out how do you make this division better? How do you help people see each other? So I'm always thinking about it myself, and I've got to admit I can see my elephant leaning, the way that I mean, because I'm always thinking about it. And I realize, oh yeah, I was totally doing post hoc rationalization there.
Yeah, yeah,
I was totally explaining what it is that, making up reasons. I can hear them in my head, right?
yeah,
I
yeah,
did this
yeah.
because this, and this. And I loved, in the book, John compares the writer to a president's press secretary, who literally is never going to walk out and say, oh yeah, I totally messed up.
No,
Right?
boy, having worked in Washington for a number of years before moving to Tallahassee, when I saw that, when he mentioned that, I was like, oh yeah, I have seen this so many times. And I'll tell you too, once your eyes are open to this kind of phenomenon, you begin to see it, or at least wonder how much it's playing a part in all sorts of things. There have been a lot of Supreme Court decisions that have come down that, now that I've kind of been awakened to this way of kind of looking at things, I look at it and I think, did these justices carefully walk through and, after weighing everything, come to this conclusion? Or are the opinions that we're reading really just their rational, post hoc rationalization of an kind of instinct or gut feeling that they had about how they wanted to rule? And obviously, I mean, one of the things that's great about the book is that, though he points out that this is the way that we're wired, and the way most people operate, he doesn't dismiss reason and say, oh well, we ought to just be completely guided by intuition. But he just wants us to see that we're all susceptible to these tendencies. We ought not to pride ourselves in being cool, calm, rational people, and that in some ways we ought to, at times, trust our gut, and to appreciate the intuition and the things that it helps to, the ways that it helps us to make wise decisions sometimes.
Yeah, and I love your point about how he's not saying, well, just give up.
Right,
We're
right.
never going to be rational, but makes the argument that if you, with the elephant and rider metaphor, it's don't change the elephant, don't change the rider, change the path. And so, your example of the Supreme Court, as a citizen of this country, I would really like to think that their process can and should be specifically truly engaging with different opinions so that it isn't a post hoc
Yeah.
rationalization. And to the
Well,
extent that we are not engaging with our political foes, whether it's, with our Uncle Joe or whether it's in Congress or at the Supreme Court, we're losing that ability to place ourselves inside of a context that will help us make really good decisions together.
yeah, he's both acknowledging the way things are and also in some ways calling us to higher standards and to say, yes, we're all wired this way. We need to be aware of it. We need to know our susceptibility to being guided too much by instinct and tuning people out and immediately rushing to find post hoc sorts of arguments to defend our instinct. But I think he calls us to use reason and weighing things and hearing people out that we might at first blush want to write off. And so yeah, I think that's the way that the Supreme Court ought to operate, way other branches of government ought to operate, is it with more of the cool reason, weighing of pros and cons sort of approach that we all imagine that happens more often than it does. So we just need to kind of fight some of the tendencies that we might have. And I guess this really gets to one of the things that I love about the book that's actually in the introduction. I mean, a lot of times when I read or lead book clubs, I'll skip the introduction because and get into the heart of the book. But I actually spent a lot of time with the introduction because in it, one of the things that he says is, the great conclusion of this book is that you're going to discover that we're all self-righteous hypocrites, that we all imagine ourselves to be operating with the noblest intentions and with the noblest, cool reason on our side. And in the end, we do fall prey to these sorts of tendencies. And in that, I think he's um, saying something that very much is consistent with the way the founders viewed things, which is part of the reason why we have checks and balances and separation of powers and three branches of governments that are all equal and division of responsibilities between state and federal and all of that is because there was a recognition that too much power in the hands of too few people can be really dangerous because we are all flawed. We're all imperfect. We're all susceptible to doing and acting in ways and then covering over what we've done in ways that are not honorable. And so he's operating in my mind very much in a spirit that the founders would appreciate, where he acknowledges that, we're flawed human beings who can make some really big mistakes, and we need to be aware of how we approach things.
And imagine the tectonic shift. And this is something I've imagined as our crisis has deepened. Imagine if we just knew that about ourselves, right? Imagine if that were normal cultural knowledge. And in some ways, I feel like a widening of that insight across the culture is what can save us because it means that we sort of say, well, wait, we're making this decision, but we haven't heard from anybody who thinks it's a bad idea.
Right.
We ought to at least hear that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to structure our institution so that, the Queen's loyal opposition is always given a seat at the table.
Mm.
And if we did that, it really is leaning into both the founders' genius, but then also, our evolving knowledge of the human race, right? And it could make this crisis a moment where things turn in a good direction, but so far that's not happening. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the hope with all of this, I think, is that from his insights, there would be some common ground that we would be able to agree that, okay, um, we do have these tendencies. Or one of the most fascinating, perhaps the most fascinating, kind of portion of the book is that middle section where he starts talking about the taste buds. Maybe I should have you kind of lay out that whole moral foundations theory that's illustrated with his metaphor of taste buds before commenting on it. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. So again, apologies to John for if I butchered it just a little bit. But the basic premise, and this is based on surveys that they've done and a lot of input data. The basic idea is that we humans have different moral taste buds, and he classified them across basically five different moral channels. And the first one is care and harm. The second is fairness and cheating. And the third is loyalty betrayal. The fourth is authority subversion. And the fifth is purity sanctity. And the idea, what they saw in their data, and frankly, some of what I think is most important for our work that really has that we've brought into the work regularly is the idea is that there's some difference in the moral taste buds or the moral channels between liberals and conservatives. And I think of it often as like the knobs on an equalizer, right? That you've got these six or these five knobs, and that you go back and forth and pivot them. And what to me was so fascinating about his findings is that he found that liberals and conservatives were actually very similarly aligned, and the equalizer was at about the same level on the first two moral channels. So that is care and harm and fairness and cheating. That across our society, we really do have a pretty similar concern about those, and that also those are kind of the first among all of the taste buds, the moral taste buds or channels. Um, and then the rest of them, which he would classify more as the binding moral foundation. So the moral taste buds are channels that sort of involve societies grouping together in ways that we bind with each other. Uh, Conservatives were more concerned about those channels, so loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and purity, sanctity. There's a lot of postscripts and expanded information on all of this, but to me, for our work, the thing that was another aha moment for me is that we may not be seeing these things the same way. And also, as someone who is kind of center left in my thinking, I think it helped me to understand that when conservatives are weighing the moral correctness of a position, they are not so much devaluing care and fairness uh, compared to me. They're spreading their concerns over a larger number of factors. And so the example that to me fits best with that, this is immigration. So it might be easy for me to look at someone who's conservative who believes that, we should have very strong immigration laws, that the border should be sealed up, that it would be easy for me to assume that you don't care about the person who's experiencing danger and threat in their country and is simply coming here, for safety. It isn't that you don't care, it's that you think about loyalty, which is we have to be concerned about the safety and status of the people who are in our country first. Authority, we have to follow the laws, and there's laws that dictate how immigrants come in, and that you have to prioritize those. So I think for me, it became a real hinge point for feeling like I had a way better understanding of people who didn't think like me politically.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that made this book so helpful, especially in some of the discussions that I've had, book clubs and stuff, because I've had several that have skewed heavily towards center right readers or audiences or whatnot. And I think a lot of the folks in that world have appreciated the fact that John has taken the time to kind of identify that, yeah, it's not like you say out of a lack of compassion or a lack of concern, often that they may take positions at odds with those on the center left. It's that they're kind of weighing multiple factors or more factors, perhaps, and trying to find the right mix or right balance of how to kind of weigh these different competing concerns. And in a certain sense, because he presents this all with this metaphor of taste buds, there's a sense in which John doesn't say this explicitly, and but I think some of the conservative readers that I've walked through this book with have kind of taken away from this sense that in a subtle sort of way he may be suggesting that the folks on the right may actually have a more sophisticated palate, if you will, a more sophisticated taste, or set of taste buds than those on the left. And I don't really know that that's his intent, and I don't really know that he would that's what he's driving at. I don't think it's really that important to come away from that, because but I do think that it kind of shows a respect for people who really are coming at things differently from John. And I think a lot of people felt like, hey, this guy gets us even though he isn't one of us. And I think that is a real strength to the book, because so often what happens in a lot of these kind of discussions is that conservatives are made to feel like, oh, you aren't as educated, you aren't as smart, you aren't as sophisticated as folks on the left, and therefore we don't really need to treat your opinion with the same measure of respect that we do others on the left. And I think John's pushing back against that in a subtle way, and in a very helpful way. Even though, to be honest, I think he may sell his own progressive tribe, so to speak, short, in that, like, for example, on the question of sanctity and purity, a lot of the discussion there centers around questions of sexual morality, and there's no question that conservatives would have a higher um, standard, if you will, on kind of what is or is not, or a different standard at least of what is or is not, appropriate behavior. But what's interesting is that, like, when you get to things like environmentalism, I think that there is among people who, or vegetarianism or things like that, you'll often see among groups that are more commonly associated with the left, you'll see people who have purity or sanctity concerns that manifest themselves in ways that are different from the way that conservatives do on those same issues, and that are more like the way conservatives approach sexual issues. And so it's just kind of interesting how these categories sometimes play out a little bit differently depending on what the topic is.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I would say that I think, what you're describing in terms of my fellow liberals' reaction to conservatives sort of not really processing the moral foundation's taste bud difference, I have now seen repeatedly play out through the years. And and it's funny because when I'm talking about this to conservative colleagues, one of the things I try to say is I honestly think this is not a matter of sort of intentional judgmentalism. It's a matter of blindness. It's like
Yeah.
I'm not really processing what you're thinking about here. So in my mind, it comes down to care and fairness.
Yeah.
Care and fairness. And so you're not coming to what I hold as being about care and fairness. So that means that I think you're uncaring and you're unfair. And if you play that out across the society, I do really think that I consider it a tragedy because, like I say, I don't think it's intentional. And it's a tragedy because, you get the kind of condescension and judgment when you engage with people and you start to sort of wall yourself off. And so to me, I feel like the past decades have been a process of conservatives not feeling understood and feeling judged and condemned, and then withdrawing, and then they find themselves in an echo chamber, and the information isn't good, and rinse, repeat, recycle, and that's sort of where we are. I mean, I guess I think that one of the reasons that I think this is so important is I hope that people who come to this work from the left side of the aisle really take some time to think through and immerse themselves in some of this the way that I have. And then all of a sudden you start, the way that I describe this is you start seeing the world like there's a name, maybe there's stereograms of those pictures that you
Mm,
look at it and you see one picture, and then all you keep looking, and all of a sudden it jumps out at you that there's a second picture.
mm.
And so I've had just the weirdest life experience where I'm still center left. I still see that first picture primarily, but then I can go, okay, I know there's another picture here. Let's move my focus around, and then all of a sudden I go, whoa, there
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, no, I think, and I think some of this kind of plays out. A lot of these sorts of ideas I filter through just my own kind of family life experience and stuff. And there will be times when, um, you know, I think in a lot of marriages and a lot of families, you'll have a situation where the dad might be trying to weigh a array of things, and the mom is saying, "Hey, the safety of our baby is paramount. Why are we even thinking about these other things?
Yeah.
If the
And
little one is in any way threatened, we've got to look out for Johnny or
and
whatever."
and how could
And
you not care
right,
as much as I
exactly.
do?
But it illustrates in my mind when you see those kind of situations, it illustrates how needed both perspectives are. That on the one hand, yeah, you need people that are kind of thinking big picture about all of the various considerations that are important, but you also at times need folks that are just camped on, wait a minute, we can't really proceed here until we make sure this is taken care of. And so I've come away from this um, with a better understanding of both sides, and a greater appreciation really for both sides and why people come at this. And so there have been times I've been in discussions where conservatives will kind of draw this argument that or this conclusion that I'm not sure John intends of saying, "Oh, well, sounds like he's saying we're more sophisticated." And I'm like, well, be careful because you can make a strong argument that if you're going to camp on one of these different considerations, care and harm is a pretty good one to camp on. And there needs to be an acknowledgement of that from people on the right toward people on the left. And oh, by the way, this happens to be, in my mind, consistent with um, a, a Judeo-Christian understanding of a lot of these things, which many people on the right care about, because concepts like grace and mercy and whatnot are, to me, very much caught up in that whole care and harm and trying to look out for and have compassion for others. So anyway, all that's just to say that these uh, uh, these categories and this way of looking at the kind of moral foundations should not be used to kind of divide and to say our side's better than your side, but instead should be used to better understand and ultimately better appreciate people who see the world differently, because we can all benefit from having people in our lives who may look at things a little bit differently or have greater concern for this than for the other, um, so that we find that kind of perfect blend of how to weigh all of these considerations when we're faced with a public issue or for that matter, a private decision of some kind.
Yeah, and if we can't find a way to create that balance by being in relationship with each other, by appreciating the differences in the ways that we approach problems and doing it to some extent together, then what happens is you put this into these moral differences, the taste bud differences, into motion inside of a polarized environment, and you start to get to where it's like we're not getting better by our interaction. Our distance and sort of the equal and opposite reaction cycle is actually spinning us into these kind of untenable and ridiculous positions, right?
Mm,
Where if you're on the left, you just refuse to think of anything
yeah,
but care and fairness. And I see a rise on the right, sort of, maybe in some ways reacting against the care
yeah,
and fairness focus. And it's almost about the cruelty. It's about
yeah,
the flying, in the face of, yeah, no, this isn't nice. And we
yeah,
mean it that way. And
yeah.
it's not true to any of our better nature, because from John's work that conservatives care the same in normal circumstances that are not dysfunctionally polarized. They care the same about care and fairness.
Yeah, and I think in some respects, a lot of this is helped by the fact that prior to introducing these ideas, he's kind of taken us through that whole rider elephant phenomenon, because we can easily find ourselves gravitating just instinctively in a knee-jerk fashion toward the position that those that we usually agree with when a public issue arises. And I think by helping us have different categories for ways of looking at things, it will hopefully kind of serve as a way for us to, instead of just instinctively going with our usual tribe, instead stepping back and saying, hey, wait a minute, are there some things here that I'm not considering enough or considering in the right way that I ought to think about differently? And when you begin to do that, you may still end up ultimately drawing the same conclusions, but you're probably going to come away with a better understanding of why those who disagree with you do, and with a better ability to move toward them, perhaps, or find some sort of acceptable middle ground at times. And I think that's very, very important and very useful.
So this makes me think of another one of my favorite concepts in this book, in terms of application to this work, and that is the concept that morality binds and it blinds. That it brings groups of people together in common moral purpose, but then it blinds us as there's a groupish, groupthink sort of nature to that
Mhm.
bringing of together, and it blinds us to things that are sort of, outside of our immediate concern and awareness. And to me, that in some ways, I feel like we deeply underappreciate the fact that so many of the dynamics we're stuck in are very much group dynamics. They are about the group and about that morality that binds and blinds.
Yes, and it, this is why, to me, a lot of the need of the hour is to find groups that we can be a part of that are, you know, not driven by or organized around politics, because I think a lot of times we benefit from, and this is very Robert Putnam-esque, we benefit from social clubs and civic organizations and, all sorts of enterprises that arise in local communities that bring people together who may see the world differently when it comes to, election day or day of worship or whatever it might be, but who can nevertheless find common ground on other days and at other times. And two part of our problem in my mind is that all of life has become too politicized, and we would benefit from stepping back and learning to kind of look at things a little bit differently, and then to seek out ways that we can interact with folks who may be different from us, but can bring to groups that we're a part of some spice, or some ability to see into our blind spots that can help lead to better group decisions, better group activities, and can help us individually grow.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And then in the intuitionist model, that in the elephant and the rider terms, what happens when you do that, when you're locating your elephant around a, a diverse number of other elephants, and your intuition becomes based on, some common purpose that can be having a good time, watching a movie or, dancing or whatever, um, and positive contact, that those things then make your elephant lean.
Yeah.
And just naturally, your elephant is going to lean towards those people that you have that experience with. And in the way that my life has played out, because my world is now, uh, some of the people that I love the most in the world because of this work completely disagree with me on politics.
Oh,
And and as a result, what happens because of all that positive contact I have and the relationship I have with them, we don't really agree on politics more than we ever did. But politics are about the 20th least, the most important thing to me
mm,
about them, right?
yeah.
So it's sort of like, well, no, that's my friend.
Right.
And my friend has kids and we love to talk about this together and this and this and this and oh yeah, okay, politics.
Right.
And it's that closeness, that diverse groupishness, that is exactly what's happening is my elephant is leaning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And absent that contact, and if then it's not going to happen, and I won't have that generosity in my heart and them back to me again.
Well, and I found in this, and I'm sure you probably saw this as well, that that whole concept of elephants rubbing noses and basically, John's point here is that if we really want to persuade people, we shouldn't imagine that it's going to be with a content heavy or perhaps content only sort of approach. That if we could just merely share the facts with someone as we see them with someone else, that that will be all that's required to move them. That indeed, really what happens is when people move in one direction or another, it's often because they have encountered in their own personal life someone who sees the world differently that they have been attracted to and say, wow, this person has some insight or some ideas or some ways of living or doing things that I find appealing and that I want to learn and know more about. And because we have kind of warmed up to them at an intuition level, we can then begin to entertain ideas that we might not have otherwise been willing to entertain. And so, yeah, from my perspective, that's a very Village Square-ish, or Village Square friendly sort of way of seeing things, because I do think it's true that part of the reason why the work of bridging across differences is so much easier, not, well, maybe I should say, it is less hard at the local level. It's not easy, but it's less hard at the local level where you're rubbing shoulders with neighbors and people that you encounter in your own personal life, rather than just sending missiles across the, from one foxhole toward another at the national level. And an exchange of ideas among strangers is not likely to lead to common ground in the same way that a friendship that forms over, dinner and drinks and good discussion with someone in your community is likely to foster.
Yes, yes. And I think that it's one of the deepest insights of the Village Square in a practice wisdom way. And in fact, to be honest, I keep meaning to have a little bit more time to put some bones around this and talk more to John about it. Is that this can happen as across a whole room full of people, a whole room full of people at the same time. That it doesn't have to be, okay, to fix this, we need two Americans to talk with each other times 150 million, right? That this is a group dynamic and function, and so we have a lot of experience putting 200 and 300 people in a room and creating something that that is transcendent and that moves people as a group in that room. And so there are a couple of concepts that from this book that I think are important, that are, again, some of my favorites to use, that are kind of applicable to this point that I'm making. And the first is the concept of weird, which was actually coined by Joseph Henrich. And he's got a book that he's written on it. And so weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And the basic premise of that um, is that we is that what I think a lot of us in Western societies have come to think of as being just the way that you think and you make decisions, is really very, very unusual and rare. And that if you think, it's a little bit about those stereogram pictures again, that weird way of thinking is more instrumental. It's more spreadsheet brain. It more takes different aspects of an issue and picks them out and analyzes them, from that perspective. Whereas the way that the majority of the world thinks is, in fact, kind of more holistically. It's like you sort of, in the stereogram example, you sort of blur your vision. You kind of go, oh yeah, no, that's not the right thing. And so that in some ways, I think that as we try to tackle the problem of societal division, I think a lot of us come into that with our weird brains on our heads.
Mm.
And we're thinking, okay, analytically, I see this, this, and this. Then I think they kind of come at it from almost kind of a therapy model,
Mm.
right? Which is, this is a psychological, individual dynamic that's happening here. And I have two bones to pick with that. One is, if that is really the case, and of course it is somewhat true, if that is the primary driver of this, it's going to take us forever.
Mm.
And two, I think we're not thinking well enough. Again, going back to the moral foundation theory differences, uh, a lot of people who come from a liberal perspective who go into this work, or from even just a Western and highly educated
Yes.
perspective, tend to not be thinking in the clumpy groupishness that in fact is an incredible driver of human behavior, the Edmund Burke's society's little platoons. And so that has been a deep learning of mine through this whole process, is I've got to think groupishly. What is the clump of humans that we're trying to engage, and how do you trade that up so that there's the kind of diversity that you're talking about in a room? So any thoughts that you wanted to add about the weird idea?
Yeah, I just think that here again, this is another example of the intellectual humility that I see in this work, is that he's saying, sure, we all appreciate the um, way that Western educated people approach things, and there's a lot of value to it, and there are many, many, innovations and developments in, improving civilization that have come about because of it. But he, I think, also gives a great deal of respect to people from other parts of the world who approach things, like you say, in a much more holistic way, and don't try to break down every problem into its isolated parts and then try to put the, Humpty Dumpty back together again,
Hmm.
but instead kind of look at systems and larger macro cultural level or community level kinds of considerations, rather than looking at everything kind of through a isolated or individualistic sort of prism.
Yeah.
So I know we're running short on time here, but you're a big fan of his hive switch idea, and we really shouldn't close before you have a chance to explain that and to wax eloquent about its importance.
Well, we'll see about the waxing eloquent, but that, in fact, was going to be my second principle that, to me, I
Oh,
think is
good.
really important, and one of our primary insights. So if you're thinking groupishly and you have this community of people in the room, that is where we've seen the hive switch operate. So I'll ask you to sort of fill in if I miss something or if I mischaracterize something. But the basic concept here in The Righteous Mind is that we humans are 90% chimp and 10% bee. And the 90% chimp is the side of us that we're all pretty familiar with, right? Is the we go for what we want. We're, instrumental in thinking about ourselves out in the world. And the 10% B, he asks us to imagine it as a switch that's on the back of all of our heads, called the hive switch. And it can be activated like that. Like a moment can activate the hive switch. And that all of a sudden, when we're in that moment, we are we are feeling a part of a whole, with the people around us, in an elevated way, that I will do anything, I will put aside my profane, chimpish concerns to be a part of this greater whole. And so to me, examples of the hive switch are, I mean, the strongest one in my lifetime is, do you remember, like, immediately after 9/11, it you you the whole country had their hive switch punch,
Mhm.
boom. All of a sudden, we are part of a whole. And I even remember just like walking down the street and looking at people differently. Like I would look at them and see them, and it's like, look what we're going through together, kind of.
Mhm.
Didn't last as long as it ought to have, but that examples of the hive switch. Now they fell out of my brain. Do you have examples that you
Yeah,
would throw
so
out there?
I often think about like the behavior you see at concerts where people will, spontaneous once someone will start swaying hands in a particular direction and soon the whole crowd is doing so or whatnot. And so there's a kind of communal experience there where people are both enjoying the music individually, but every bit as much communally. But an even better example in my mind is like, and this is similar to your 9/11 example, is like I remember after the bombing at the Boston Marathon, a few days later, there was a game at Fenway Park where the Red Sox play, and there's a tradition in Boston that they always sing "Sweet Caroline." I think it's during the seventh inning stretch or sometime kind of late in the game, and the 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 kind of fervor
Yeah,
that the fans on the first game after that horrible tragedy, because this was this thing that the city kind of shared together. And there had been some ceremonies at the beginning of the game where they, unveiled Boston Strong t-shirts and things of that nature. But then when it came time to sing Sweet Caroline that particular day,
yeah,
it, kind of gave everyone goosebumps because it was this sense that, okay, this is something that we as a community hold together, that share together and appreciate together. And this unites us and binds us, and especially in a time of struggle and hardship and pain, it gives us comfort to know that we are not alone and that we are part of a larger whole. So anyway, that to me was a kind of a hive switch moment
yeah.
that stands out.
You even telling that story is punching my hive switch, because I'm starting to tear up, feeling the empathy of that moment. And it really, in some ways, the hive switch is, we can be so cynical about human beings sometimes. But when you see that happen repeatedly, when you start looking at for it, and with our experience, when you start planning to try to punch it, like our big events, we are working really hard to get people to have that experience and punch that hive switch. And it's an amazing human capacity. It's one that we need to remember we have the capacity for. And I believe it's one, and you can feel it when it happens, right?
Yeah.
When you're in a room of people, you can feel it when it happens. And we had, one example, is that we had a big event, called Created Equal, a conversation about race and founding ideals in our hometown, and we brought a very inspiring speaker in, and And at the end of it, we had kind of a local gadfly whose habit is regularly to get in front of the commission and just yell at them, the governing commissions, yell at them for 3 minutes. That's his tradition. He literally walked out with one of the commissioners that his tradition was to yell at. And they came over to us and they said, "Hey, we just wanted to tell you that we had the greatest conversation." And this was a really meaningful moment, and we have plans to have lunch together. And and so that is, it happens, it happens across a room. I'm sure that there were, 100 other stories that I wasn't privy to,
Right.
that engage that hive switch. So, that's how we do what we do. That in some ways, that's kind of our secret formula is, we work really hard to create the conditions in which we're going to feel transcendent and we're going to feel bonded to the people we share a community with. And it doesn't always work. We
No.
definitely have times that we kind of go, yeah, we didn't get there, but we try to.
And it often doesn't happen or can't even. I mean, sometimes, yeah, you can do things that will stimulate it, but oftentimes it's something that kind of arises almost organically. I'm reminded of that kind of closing scene in the movie Almost Famous, where the band has been out on the road for months on end and they're kind of sick of each other and tired of this life, and they're getting on the bus to head back to where they live to, go on break or whatnot. And they're all beat up and on the bus and nobody's saying a word. And then all of a sudden, one of them breaks out singing Elton John's Tiny
Tiny
Dancer.
Dancer. It's
And then
almost famous.
all of a sudden, it just kind of spreads from one row to another, and the groupies and the roadies and everybody ends up getting involved. And it becomes this kind of really beautiful moment that all happened spontaneously, but brought this group that was not living in harmony with one another and kind of tired of each other, all of a sudden back together for this kind of really great moment where they're like, we really do love each other and appreciate each other and share things that are almost inexpressible. And I think that's a beautiful thing and something that often can't be kind of planned or organized or contrived, but when it happens, it's a beautiful thing, and
You
it can
see
only
it and you
happen.
feel it, and it
Yeah.
changes everything.
Yes.
And Bill, I can't believe you use that example. We have never had this conversation. And to be honest with you, I have never thought of that clip that this way, but it is my literally, if you ask me, one favorite movie clip, that's it. And I,
Well,
I mean, I have it in my YouTube, and I every once in a while, if I feel bad, I play it. And so I had never connected the dots.
all
But
right,
that
look,
was my precious hive switch.
all right, I have to make a confession here. The I had never really thought about this. I don't even know that I had seen that scene. Um, but Craig Detweiler, who you'll remember, came and did the Purple State of Mind program that we did, gosh,
Oh,
many
yeah.
many moons
One
ago.
of one of our favorites, along with his political opposite, John
Yeah,
Marks, Craig
yeah.
Detweiler and John
So
Marks.
Craig was at some event trying to help people understand the power of communal singing, and he was really speaking of it kind of, I think, explaining to people outside who have no kind of religious experience or background why there is kind of how church congregations or other religious groupings will often form, bonds, and how communal singing is often something that brings people together. And so he drew on that story, and I found it so fascinating. I went and looked it up, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is the really it's a good movie and a great scene. It's just a great scene." And so it does kind of illustrate how, yeah, things can often happen that are spontaneous and organic, but that bind people together, and that we ought to be in relationship with people where that kind of thing can happen, and
Can happen.
cultivating
Yeah.
the kinds of settings and opportunities for those kind of things to arise spontaneously.
There is no more meaningful way to me to close this conversation than having spoken both Hive Switch and Almost Famous Tiny Dancer Scene. It's perfect. Cut, wrap.
It almost made me like Elton John. I mean, I actually there are actually a number of tunes of his that I enjoy.
Yes, I was going to say then we're going to have another disagreement because my ringtone is Benny and the Jets. So
Okay.
yeah. So, just a quick preview of sort of, I think what we're going to do in some of the coming episodes is pull these ideas down into practices that we have come to rely on to achieve some of the results in bridging divisions. And Bill, it's been lots of fun to hang
Yeah.
out as usual.
Yeah, let's do it again soon. Enjoyed it a lot.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Liz.
Good weekend.
You too.
Blue Jean baby, LA lady. Hey, I got that song caught in my head. You didn't know it was me, did you? It's Corey Nathan, back here with you. No, it's not Elton John. It's far from Elton John. But now that song is rolling around in my noggin, so I had to share it. I was just, you caught me. I was singing it. But it was a perfect encapsulation of what this talk was all about, in that those group dynamics, sometimes the hive mind, kicks in, and we just get caught up in the moment with our neighbors and brothers and sisters from our neighborhood or from our bus or from our wherever. So I love that. There's hope for us yet if we can join together in song. Not that my rendition was anything to write home about, but this talk was off to the races right out of the get-go. Liz and Bill caught my attention right out of the gate. If you're a fan of the Village Square or just this podcast, if you're listening around the country or around the world as I am, perhaps you're committed to these conversations across our differences. And like I said, right out of the gate, I think it was Bill that was talking about using books or music, or I was thinking of movies or artwork as a good conversation starter. Hey, did you see Dune? Did you see the new Apple TV Plus show about the studio? Did you, whatever, a piece of music or a concert or something? It's a great starting point that isn't necessarily bifurcated in terms of this side and the other side. So that's been really helpful for me to find common cultural points of connection that I can connect with others, regardless of what our political affiliations might be, regardless of what our dispositions might be, regardless of which politicians we might be voting for. And this was really helpful. Another one actually is I'm in a business group. There's business endeavors that I'm involved in, and I happen to know, getting to know folks over the years, that there are folks who, at least at the national level, vote very differently than I do. And it's funny, once we really start to get into those conversations at the local and state level, there are a lot of similarities, despite how passionately we might feel about whichever name we're rooting for or voting for at the top of the ticket. And listen, you start any conversation on any of Jonathan Haidt's books, but going back to The Righteous Mind, you pulled again. It's you had me at hello, as they say. But just one of the many points of that book is revisiting the idea of intellectual humility, or another one of my favorite Jonathans. Although if he happens to be listening to this, he is my favorite Jonathan Rausch. He caught me one time. He said, one of. Anyway, Rausch would refer to it as epistemic humility. I think it's been referred to, the study has been referred to on this program a number of times, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Two scholars from the late 90s did an effect on how there are people who overestimate their expertise and it just makes them dumber. Whereas the more we learn about a subject, the more truly expert or virtuous we become in a field, the more we realize we don't know. And there's a natural humbling effect that happens. So scholars like Jonathan Haidt, who's contributed so much to the culture, so much to scholarship, so much to our societal discourse about what ails us and how we can move forward, it makes sense that he would still have intellectual humility. Now, where does that come into play? In his fields, not just in academia with other academics, but from regular folks like me. He's proven again and again that he genuinely wants to hear what others think, which is very much in the spirit of Village Square. I did appreciate the part of the conversation that addressed the elephant and the rider, the elephant being basically our intuition and the rider being our reason, and acknowledging the reality that it's our intuition that's the elephant, the intuition, and we're the reason. The rider is merely hoping to guide it. And I loved the parallel with the separation of powers, how it addresses the reality of the fact that we more often than not, by the order of magnitude that an elephant outweighs a rider, follow our intuition. So we have these institutions and structures to help us use our reason to arrive at just results, to arrive at justice. The other section that got me thinking was the section about how different people have different moral taste buds, a different order of priorities, and to some of the best conversations I've had with people across differences is when we start with better understanding each other's priorities and values, and not diminishing those values or dismissing the possibility that if something like prioritizing loyalty versus betrayal over and above the concept of care versus harm, that if they prioritize loyalty, it doesn't mean that care versus harm is outside of their order of priorities. It just means they're ordering it differently than someone else. And to Liz's point, this often comes across as judgmentalism. There have been lots of different words for it over the years, canceling and what have you, and other types of collective actions that have been deployed in order to shame people that by not having exactly the same order of priorities as the in-group, or how you're identifying the in-group, then there are great consequences to be paid for that, as if that person doesn't value a lot of the same things that I might value, for example. It's just, if they have to stack it vertically, they might stack it a little bit differently than I do. So that's a good awareness to have. And again, as Liz said, it's not a matter of intentional judgmentalism. It's a matter of blindness. But I did appreciate how it's the group dynamics that bind us and blind us. Like that song, the reference to that scene in Almost Famous, where we're bound together. But if we're only among those who have the same mores that we do, who have that same order of priorities, like I was just discussing, who have the same language that we do, sort of social language, if you will, then it does indeed blind us to those who might think differently than we do. Lastly, I'll just say I really am looking forward to the conversations where we're talking about practices. In other words, how do we do this thing? It's these conversations, these Flying Pig conversations, the Flying Pig Academy conversations are really helpful for me because it helps me contextualize, get better references. I got to go back and read The Righteous Mind, for example. It's great. There are great references in contextualization, but I'm really looking forward to, okay, now what do we do about it? As I'm sure many of you are as well. So with that, it's time to close out today. Please consider joining our members and supporting this programming. You can become a member for just $7 a month or $76 a year, and your business can join for $250. Go to villagesquare.us/donate to join today. That's villagesquare.us/donate. While you're there, sign up for Village Square's newsletter to stay up to date with everything happening at the Village Square. Go to villagesquare.us, scroll down to the bottom for the sign up box, or when you go to villagesquare.us, It's right there. There's a pop-up that lets you sign up for the newsletter as well. And lots going on, so it's definitely worth signing up there. Funding for this program was provided through a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or National Endowment for the Humanities. We appreciate you listening to this edition of the Flying Pig Academy with Liz Joyner and Bill Maddox on how Jonathan Haidt wrote the book for pigs with higher aspirations. Until next time, we challenge you to reach out with an open heart and mind to someone who doesn't think or look like you. It really does change everything. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks so much for listening to Village Squarecast.